Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Robyn Faith Walsh, welcome back. How are you?
Fine, thanks for having me.
Thank you. Look, I would love to just spend 10 minutes, just in my opinion, express how important I think the work you do is, how much thinking is put into reevaluating how we have for so long had crystallized models of orality and you name it. And you just come along and you just insert this interesting hypothesis and then everyone goes crazy, and I'm just thankful for your work because it makes me sincerely want to reevaluate how the scholars for so long have looked at the gospels, maybe how we're looking at the New Testament. And so for that, thank you.
Oh, that's really nice of you. It's my pleasure.
Absolutely. No, you're doing some really amazing work, and you're factoring in much more than the isolated image we have of just looking at these gospels within these traditions, within a Jewish only framework. Like there's so much baggage that we've had amongst scholarship, and maybe post-Holocaust, sympathies, maybe who knows, conservative reactions to some of the 19th, early 20th century critical scholarship. I mean, there's so much that probably factors into why these ideas tended to go the way they did. And then you come in on the new book, The Next Quest for the Historical Jesus, and you just punch all of that right in the throat.
That's kind of a pretty brutal math. I wasn't trying to do that necessarily, but maybe we should talk a little bit about what this project was and give some more context. Although, yeah, you make me sound pretty cool, so I appreciate.
You are pretty cool. You are.
Um, so the piece you're talking about, I've had a few things come out in the past year, and it's a chapter that came out in a book that was edited by Chris Keith and James Crossley called The Next Quest for the Historical Jesus. And there was actually a conference as part of the presentation of these papers when they were working papers that the product of that conference and the work of some other scholars is it's a pretty big book, actually. I forget how many chapters there are, but it's like over 30, I think, of some really interesting scholars who, even though it's called The Next Quest for the Historical Jesus, and some of your listeners and viewers might know that there's been this long tradition. You were mentioning the 20th century and different movements within the study of the historical Jesus. There was a quest for the historical Jesus at one point, and then there was like the new quest for the historical Jesus or something like that. Then there was like the next quest. And what this was were these groups of scholars who would try to do things like, can we retrieve the historical Jesus? If so, here's what we can know about him, or kind of different gradations of trying to reconstruct those histories. And so, with this next quest for the historical Jesus, people might think, oh, it's another one of these historical Jesus projects where they're just trying to figure out, like, almost like the Jesus seminar, what did he really say? Or, what's the historical circumstances of X, Y, and Z? So, when I was asked to join this, though, it became very clear that it wasn't that traditional quest, that what is actually going on here is more of a very, historically critically minded approach to the subject. And the scholars involved are people like Mark Goodacre, is there. Sarah Rollins, I believe, was a part of this. Like, there are a number of other really great scholars who are bringing a more critical lens to the entire project. So right off the bat, I should say, I'm not the only one. What was it? Punching the throat, like scholarship. But as an example, and I really can only speak for myself. I was tasked, like I was assigned a topic essentially, and when I was asked to join, they wanted me to write about city and country, which is kind of an interesting topic, except that you can see where that comes from, right? Like, there's usually some kind of investigation into, say, the historical Galilee as part of the historical Jesus project. What did it look like? What was going on in Sepphoris? Like that kind of thing, right? But I didn't want to do it that way because that is kind of scholarship that's been done, not to put too fine a point on it.
Even James Crossley kind of dabbles with that. But yeah.
But everybody, yeah, I mean, I think that it's a topic that's important, and certainly there are new findings all the time in archaeology that can contribute to those kinds of conversations if we're just kind of talking about the scope I was in. But to me, if you're going to really do kind of a radical new next quest for the historical Jesus, however you want to frame it, then we have to look at why we're asking the question in the first place and what's implicit in that question to begin with. So for me to ask the gospels, for instance, to tell me anything concrete about the historical Jesus as it's traditionally conceived in scholarship, and you're right, there have been different tracks, right? Like you mentioned post World War II. I think rightly there was less of a sort of German romantic nationalist view of Jesus that switched to more of a, well, how do we understand Jesus in Judea as a Jewish person, right? Like those are natural corrections and important ones that respond to historical and social moments, but also like scholarship tends to take different tracks at various times because one theory or method will sort of be exhausted and another one, it reveals a new conversation to be had. So, but I thought to myself, if I'm going to do this, I want to advance that conversation. And I'm not going to assume the Gospels in this case necessarily give me anything historical that I can rely on to make a statement about city or country and Judea and Galilee and or Jerusalem or anything like that. But along the lines of what I've argued in the past, that the Gospels themselves are pieces of literature produced in a particular historical moment. Looking at it that way, I started to see the idea of city and country as a study in the literary constructions of city and country. And what tends to happen to heroes and other hallowed figures in Greek and Roman literature when they move from the country to the city. Usually it's corrupting, right? Usually trouble is brewing. Usually things come to a head. Usually it's the city that ends up being, the site of some kind of degradation. Whereas in the country, say in the Greek novel, you have, the love interest frolicking in fields, one to one with the gods until like the pirates capture them and bring them to the big city, right? And actually this is a story like Home Alone too. Right? This is something that is a motif that continues in a lot of dramatic literature, and I started to see that same element in the Gospels. So that's the start of it. That's where it came from. But then we can talk about what I actually argue in a minute.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. I didn't mean.
No, you didn't. No, go right ahead.
You go into parallels between Howard's and in the Gospels.
Well, yeah, that's because the conference was in London. That's
Yeah, and that was a great choice, of course, to kind of point out, like, you suggest that Justice Foster's novel frames a debate over who will inherit England. The Gospels frame a debate over who will inherit the kingdom, Judea or Rome. Given this rhetorical function, how would scholars reevaluate the so-called historical elements in the Gospels? Are we dealing with more literary inventions, as you seem to suggest, designed to shape ideological claims rather than records of real events? Like my question, I have so many questions. That's the problem. Number one, because y- like I also struggle with this, and I hope I'm formulating this properly. But like, people go, well, okay, just because Carl Olaf Sanders just had a discussion with Dennis MacDonald, and they were talking about how both of them think Homeric illusions are happening in some way in the Gospels. And we wanted Carl for the record because he's been weaponized against MacDonald by apologists that I've had to encounter. Carl comes on and practically goes, "Yeah, the Gospels have Homeric, what he calls subtle emulation, not purposeful hermeneutical engagement in his view." McDonald goes, "Hey, I'm glad to hear, you would at least say Homer's being utilized somehow in some fashion. You just don't go as far as I do as thinking that he's actually trying to write a better hero or engage with the earlier text, right?" All that to say, the conversation ended up going from there to what I think Carl started realizing implications about mimesis creates distance from history. And then he goes,
Mm,
"Yeah, but this doesn't mean that there's no history there." And
right.
McDonald goes, "You're right. Here's the problem though." And I think this is where I struggle as a non expert. Maybe you have some, in light of your article that you added here. My problem is, how can you even evaluate and know what history is when the entire modus operandi of the author is not to give you history, he's to give you a story, and it's in a way, a romanticized story, the way you kind of paint it.
Yeah, the Gospels are pretty dramatic, right?
Hey,
Right. Um,
what do we
yeah.
do?
So, I mean, I think we've probably talked about this before, but I think it's crucial to understand, like, when we use the word history, what are we saying we want, right? Like, when we're saying they're not historical, our understanding of historical is different than what historical may have meant for the ancients. Not to say that they didn't care about what actually happened or didn't happen or fact or fiction, right? But in a world in which, my joke is usually like you can't Google or fact check things or, you know what I'm saying? Like having an impression of a certain, course of events is usually sufficient. And I'm sure we talked about this with someone like Plutarch in the past or something like that. But I think the point there is to say there is definitely a history as we talk about history that you can actually retrieve from the Gospels, which is if you understand them as literary products, which they are, they're written. Like they are engaging, writing of their age, whether you wanna go all the way in with a mimesis thesis with Homer or not, or whether or not you just wanna say that you can tell there are shades of Homeric influence here probably because whoever wrote this in Greek went to school and learned Homer, right? Like, those are the things that you can say. Now, it's up to other scholars to then delve into that and say, like Dennis MacDonald has done, like, I think these particular stories and motifs are specifically from Homer, and these passages could be compared to these passages, right? Like, some scholars will go in that direction. But another way you could do it is to say, let's talk about book culture and education and what can we reasonably say about these literary networks and these particular writers. What are they displaying to us in terms of their training, their knowledge, and their engagement? Because don't forget that any writer in antiquity wants their material to be understood. There are few writers, unless they are writing for a particular kind of audience, like surrealism or like doing avant garde kind of work, where they're actually having a conversation with other avant garde writers, right? Like, we're talking about writers who want to be understood, who are trying to communicate. And there are specific ways you have to do that in antiquity that they would have been trained to do it. So that's what I think we need to look for. And when we look for those things in the text, for what we mean by historical, that's where I think you can start to make some claims that, at least as I was saying before, advance the conversation. So that's what I tried to do in this particular piece, is just be really just judicious about what I think I can say with some confidence about what I see going on in the text, but also the context, the social context of the text.
What I appreciate is you're not, like, trying to purposefully sweep away the legend, sweep away the literary motifs, sweep away fiction or anything to try and discover what actually happened, but rather enjoy looking at the product that we have as we have it, and then, where do we go from there? So, you of course, in this article, you're going to get into themata. Is that how you pronounce that?
So the word in Greek is thelma.
Thelma.
Yeah, so, that's the easiest way to say is just I get into Thelma
Thelma.
in the piece, yeah, Thelmata is another way, but yeah, Thelma.
But before you get into Thelma, I just wanna point out, before we even talk about what that is, I got it, like, I just wrote a script, like, that I'm gonna do a video on about omniscient author and the motif of omniscient awareness in the Gospels, and I thought to myself, well, this kind of is like one of these things where if we're talking about someone was just writing and they had eyewitness reportage of what really occurred, there's some questions I have, like, how did they know about this conversation between Pontius Pilate and Jesus? Questions that indicate they know too much, and as we shift to the question of Thelma and maybe what your intentions of pointing out with this literature we call the gospel, specifically Mark, because we can get lost in the weeds and maybe Luke as well, but like maybe we start with our earliest gospel, is I'm looking at that going, that's clearly like an author who knows, like God, knows everything that's happening, but then there's something else that ties into this definition of Thelma that you're probably going to unravel, and that is unlike some other authors who are cautious about when they're gonna lay out some things about miracles or claims that they know that the reader should be a little bit more like even Herodotus will be like, "That's what they say, I'm not sure." The gospel authors want you to turn off any critical lens. They want you to fall trap to the whole product of what they're trying to sell you, and it worked. Look at what it worked. So tell us about Thelma.
Um, it definitely worked. Okay, so what I argue, so remember, city and country was the topic. And so I made that general observation about moving into an urban center, things tend to go haywire. But in the course of looking at, okay, now what can I pull out of we'll talk about the Gospel of Mark. What can I pull out of that text that helps me see the text in a new light? Helps me see how Jesus, let's just use the word constructed, but how Jesus is written in the text in a new light. And I was looking at it actually in Greek. Like you're supposed to, although like you don't always do it. But I was looking at it in Greek. And I was noticing that whenever Jesus, what's typically called the messianic secret in Mark is that idea comes from a scholar named William Verda. And he was this German scholar. I mean, the last name tells me he was German, but I think he wrote that book turn of the 20th century, like 1901 or something, or like within that decade, like maybe it's like 1912, sometime around there. And he talks about this idea of the messianic secret, which is that Jesus, as he's making that journey, from rural to urban, continues to encounter people. And when he does, they either don't recognize him and they're completely bewildered, or, when somebody does kind of recognize him on the basis of his miracle working or his power, he tells them to be quiet or don't say anything to anybody or like, shh, right? And so that's what Verda called the messianic secret. I'm sure you've heard that term before. Like people still use it. I think many people still use it as an explanation for that text. And I started to think to myself, like, well, that's awfully odd, actually. Because if you do go back to Verda and read it, it's kind of like I'm being a little facetious, but not too facetious, actually, when I say that it's kind of this like Freudian investigation to the psychology of Jesus. Like it's definitely trying to get at like what kind of theology is this? And that's the premise. And so when he calls it a messianic secret, he draws all kinds of conclusions about like, well, Jesus didn't want people to know who he was because once they knew who he was, they were going to take him to Jerusalem and execute him. And so he has to intentionally delay the revelation of that. So like you get the idea, right? That's why he's misrecognized. And that's why he tells people to be quiet. Except even with the misrecognition, that didn't seem quite right. Like why put that on Jesus? It's the author who's constructing that situation. So when I was looking at it in Greek, this word Thelma and its derivatives like Thalmata or, there are all kinds of other endings. It doesn't matter, but like the way Greek is. There are all kinds of different expressions of Thelma. Now, the word means wonder or bewilderment. And so when Jesus would go and perform a miracle and there'd be a crowd around him, the crowd would be struck with Thelma. They'd be struck with wonder because he was doing something so remarkable, so unusual, and so sort of confusing that they didn't know how to process it. So the way Mark would describe it is like, he did this thing and they like looked at each other. Like there are times where he actually talks about Thelma as like they almost went out of their minds. Like they're so confused. Like, what the heck is this? And then Jesus moves on to the next thing. Now, the other place where you see that term, it's actually everywhere. And like now that I've identified this, I see it everywhere. But it's something, to Dennis MacDonald's point, you see in Homer, the hero being misrecognized wherever he goes or like being disguised when he comes home and nobody knows who he is. But it's almost also something that comes up in Virgil, who's inspired by Homer. So now think about the gospel writers. Who are they emulating in their writing? They're writing about a hero traveling around. Know any other heroes traveling around? Like it's coming from Homer or Virgil. And Virgil does the same thing. And he's also inspired by Homer. So I started to realize the messianic secret doesn't capture what's going on in the text. What does is to notice that this Thelma language is the thing that would have, I think, been with the gospel writers, and in this case, Mark understood as a way to indicate this guy has a special status. He's on this journey, again, from, country to city. He's going through this process of misrecognition that is common to a lot of unusual and subversive figures. And so the one figure I compare him to in the text directly is Camilla and Virgil. She's a warrior, but also a woman. And so every time she would like come into town, people would be like, "What? Like this is crazy." Like and he would describe people being like, "I'm going out of my mind. Like she's a woman and a warrior. I don't get it. Like who is this person? Who is she? I don't." The same kind of Thelma type language, right? So when you compare those kinds of scenes to the scenes in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus is misrecognized or like goes through and like drives people out of their minds, it already existed, right? It was already a motif out there, and I think we've been sort of misguided by Verda's, very persuasive kind of characterization of a theological idea when really it's a literary one.
There's so much that you are tapping into that I found really interesting. Like when I was reading your article, I thought about Dionysus in Euripides for a moment. I know it's different genre. I think John's gospel is more tragedy in that respect. Doesn't mean that Mark isn't, but like, there's been a lot of writings where people thought maybe this gospel is inspired somehow by Euripides. Mark W.G. Stibe thinks there may be something. I know Dennis MacDonald, Dionysian Gospel. I'm close to Hugo Mendez, and we've been talking about it. I'm like, hey, what do you think, man? And he's entertaining or hasn't really gone down the path that much, but he's like, maybe there's something there. He defers to Dennis on this, right? But in Mark, what's really odd is I just started my next script on the baptism, and the first thing you get is this like a dove, the Spirit descends from heaven. And I'm like, okay, I can find cracked over heavens with Ezekiel or something. I can find elements of scripture, and it does quote scripture. Where's the like a bird? Where's that at? There's no God moving like a bird in any Jewish antecedents I've looked for. Guess where it's all over? Virgil. It's all over the idea of Athena flying like a bird with Telemachus. In fact, I think I even have like the example here of there's also the hymn to Demeter, the hymn to Homeric hymn to Demeter. And that says like sped like a wild bird over the firm land and yielding sea seeking her child. There's just a lot of allusions to this idea of bird, divine kind of hidden theoxany uh figures where they fly off like birds. And notice the voice only speaks to Jesus in Mark. It's not everyone else, so they don't know, only you, the reader, gets it. And then, like, later, there's these little hints and stuff, and I think it foreshadows the idea of the transfiguration scene and the death. There's all sorts of cool literary stuff, like, the 2 that walk up to Jesus. I'm just throwing out literary things for you to kinda, like, capitalize on. Is like, can we sit on your left and on your right? And he says, you don't get it, do you? Well, later in that same story, there's 2 people on his left and right, and look at where they're at. And it's like, whoa, Mark's a genius. I mean, he really is a
Yeah, he
genius.
is. I love that gospel. Are you asking me about birds? Because my name's Robin. Is that maybe? By the way, we didn't plan the plaid twins, but like that kind of happened. Um, yeah, there you go. I mean, the bird thing, like this is like what makes this stuff fun, right? Because my first thought with the birds are like number one, in the catacombs, there are a lot of birds actually. Not just in the baptism, but it's usually like the dove from Noah, like bringing the branch, because the message there is about redemption. So it's context, right? So for the gospel writers, yeah, you could totally see them being inspired by something like Virgil. Although we should note that we're making kind of a statement here that's not explicit but implicit, that like we're saying the gospel writers read Latin if they're reading Virgil. So we should just like note that. But the idea that motif could be out there. The other thing too is that the bird was a vessel of the spirit, the pneuma. The other thing out there, even in medical literature, that's a vessel for spirit, are actually hens. Like they thought hens got pregnant from the wind because they thought, like, this is actually in David Litwa's work,
Yeah.
that chickens could get pregnant from pneuma. like from a big like wind gust, right? So like birds are just vessels of this stuff and they also fly around. So, like pick your metaphor or pick your association, but that's what makes this stuff so cool is that we have so little material from antiquity. I mean, we know this, but it's important to mention it because we only have little snapshots of these cross references. And so that we do the best we can, like, putting the puzzle pieces together. But like with the gospels, we are getting an inflection of something as you're rightfully pointing out. Like a lot of people talked about these kinds of motifs or these subject matters, and they're able to innovate on it. And I think that's exciting too to see where they do those kinds of innovations.
I really, really like the whole hen thing. That I think that's very interesting because, when I was growing up, I'm like, how come they keep these chickens, for example, are laying eggs all the time, and it's not necessarily due to procreation like the way we would, right? So someone in the ancient world was thinking somehow they're getting impregnated and producing an egg, right? And so here is this pneuma egg that is being inserted into a hen. I don't know if that's related in the same extent,
I don't know either, but
but it's still an interesting point you bring out. So I'm like, I'm gonna try and like anchor us to Thelma and then also like the Gospel of Mark, which is the foundation clearly for Matthew and Luke, that like it's so obvious, but also seems to anchor to Paul. That's a whole nother discussion that like, holy smokes, we've got these literary works. And I guess like William Rede, or however you pronounce his last name, I always
Ver
again.
Verda. It's
Verda?
Wrede.
Yeah,
So
Verda.
Verda. Yeah.
Okay, Verda. William Verda from 1901. Verda.
I should check that. It's early 1900s.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like somewhere way back there. You're suggesting he was approaching this theologically and kind of bringing the baggage of theology to interpreting the gospels. This brings us to a whole nother thing. And I want to keep Thelma something we can come back to because there's other gaslighting material that I think you're going to have fun like with us. Like I said earlier, the gospels want you to turn off the critical faculties and almost believe and just buy what they're selling. Um, You've made a controversial impact on the field of suggesting that maybe these gospels were created without necessarily communities steering the goals theologically on how the stories are. Is it your conclusion, or at least your hypothesis, that what happened is these very popular pieces of literature may have helped craft I'm not going to say they completely craft communities, but the communities are now being inspired due to such literature and are now having to theologize something that may not have had the intent that they are imposing. Not saying that the author of Mark was not trying to have a divine demigod hero. I think that's clear in the literary works, but all the theology like is later in the communities.
Well, now I feel trapped because I want to make a chicken and egg joke. Um, but it is kind of a chicken and egg problem, right? Because and this is what I was trying to do in the book, as you well know, which is say, like, I don't know to what extent these communities were religious around these texts. I just don't. Like, as you say, certainly the author of the Gospel of Mark or any of the Gospels, that's sort of a case of more or less. I assume these people heard about Jesus somewhere. I assume there are other people in their social ambit who care about these subject matters. Otherwise, why would they be writing these gospels, right? So it's not to deny that religious community doesn't exist or, deny that it exists for these authors.
It's not
Or
either or technically.
right. I think the problem is that we often, because of the way we use the text or the way that the text comes to be used, we make almost like a category mistake where we're like, this is a religious text. Well, the gospels are as religious as Virgil, right? Like there are other religions around Virgil that he's tapping into too. He's just creating a founding myth, a story for the Roman people. Homer, whoever Homer was, however many people Homer was, whatever Homer is, right? Wherever it came from, same thing, right? Like this becomes the basis for a number of different kinds of ideologies, religious, political, social, etc. And so I think we have to understand that when a piece of writing comes to be used in a certain way, we don't necessarily want to jump to that conclusion as the only way to read it. And I think that's where some of the, let's call them like over readings or missteps or whatever term you want to use, comes from with the Gospels, where if you just assume that community is already there, and I'm not denying that there aren't good reasons to say, like, well before the rare number of people who are able to write could write these gospels or had an interest in doing it for whatever reason they decide to write it, there probably were Jesus ecclesia, like, as Paul's letters indicate, that were in various forms of social cohesion. Obviously Corinthians versus something like Philippians, it's a whole different story, right? So you can see social development taking place. We're vaguely aware by the second century, regardless of what exactly you think about the historical value of something like the letters of Pliny and Trajan, or even the work of someone like Lucian later on, right? Talking about Peregrinus, you still get the impression that there are groups of some kind in different, various kinds of formation. And then by the second century, you have it, right? Like you can see that there are social groups. Where do those texts come into play? Well, I certainly think the texts, the Gospels, the canonical ones, and the non-canonical ones too, but the canonical Gospels come to be used by those groups, yes. They come to be an anchor for the conversations that are possible, for the developing theology, because once you have institutionalization, you have to have sort of uniform perspectives. Like, this is where the whole orthodoxy heresy debate comes into play. Like, that's just what social groups do. That's how you determine membership. Those texts get to be used for that purpose. Is that why they were written? By and for the communities? Yeah, I have a hard time with that, because what I see is what we've been talking about. Constructing Jesus as almost like his own founding Homeric hero, or founding a version of Jesus that would be intelligible and impressive to an audience that's maybe encountering him for the first time, right? And I don't mean that necessarily in an apologetic way, but even someone like Miller, who writes about the empty tomb, right? You've talked to him about this. We've talked about this. The tomb has to be empty, whether or not that actually happened. The tomb has to be empty because it means apotheosis. It means that he's a god. And whether it's in the artwork of something like the Arch of Titus, or the Greek novel where this happens to some character sometimes, or another emperor in another story from one of the Roman historians, it doesn't matter, right? Like, that's just what happens to the hero. When the hero goes from the country to the city, this is what happens. Like, whether it's Socrates or like Charaton, like this is exactly what happens. Because most of the time, people don't really want a radically different story. That's why Gladiator 2 looks like Gladiator 1. That's why all the Bourne movies are like kind of the same. That's why John McClane always, you know what I'm saying? Like, there's a formula to this stuff because it works, but also because people can understand it. And the important thing is to be intelligible. And what I definitely see from the Gospels is an attempt to be intelligible, not just to a community, if you see what I mean. It's not just about preserving a certain kind of memory necessarily, or an oral tradition. That may be a factor, but what you see are literary strategies that are just part of normal Greek and Roman writing in that period. And that's definitely also what they're doing. And so that tells me it's not just for a community, that it's for a wider audience.
This is a really fascinating angle to approach the Gospels in because we do it classicists do it, you know this, and this is out of my depth, but you might have something to attribute to Virgil on this or something of another piece of literature. Like the scholars I've been coming across pertaining to Euripides, I bring that up because Dionysus, the setting is Thebes is the major city. Where are the Maenads? In the wilderness, out in the woods, in their frenzy. They're doing nature. Okay, and here comes the hero, and they don't recognize that he is a son of Zeus. And the whole theme is just constantly up and down, and Pentheus, just this knucklehead, doesn't realize who the true king is. Jesus, a king? Anyway, you see the theme. Um, and then what happens? Well, you have the classicists say Euripides is very understanding of cults, about Dionysian cults around, but he's not writing like a religious text for that community. He's clearly doing some fiction that at least is implying there are movements. So this might be what Mark's doing, knowing about Pauline communities and, like, this kind of stuff, but he's not writing a theological text. He's clearly writing a founding myth.
Yeah, he is, and I mean, when you mention Paul, like, it's pretty clear the way he constructs some of the miracles, how they're performed, like, I think he's had access to Paul's letters because he's using technical terminology that Paul also uses. But he's doing it in the way that echoes a certain kind of strategy, right? So he's still kind of doing his own thing, and he seems aware of those letters, but it's just because it's part of a writing community, meaning the people are exchanging texts. Like that's pretty clear. Like these guys are educated, they've gone to school, texts are circulating. And so he's stepping into the fray, essentially, like to write a certain version of this. And there's an audience for it, or at least he's hoping there is, but there certainly is. And then we have other social clues for why that's the case. We know people are interested in Judean stuff in this period. They have these older holy books. People are interested in Jewish scripture. And then also, we have to remember that, especially as we move into the second century, there's a fair amount of evidence that what we call literacy was increasing. We have this tendency, especially when we talk about literacy, we all know the statistics, like 2% to 11% of people could produce something like the Gospels, depending on how like generous you're feeling that day. And so we tend to treat it as a very rarefied community of writers, and it is, right? But we also know that there's a proliferation, at least according to our material record to this point, of things that are like not high literature. So, curse tablets or the Greek novel or paradoxography. So people writing paradoxographers don't like this, so with my apologies, but like Ripley's Believe It or Not. And so maybe we've talked about News of the World. I used to love that newspaper. It was like around in the 80s and it was always like that child found in cave. I used to always buy them at the supermarket. But it was always like some clearly concocted story, but like you'd follow it. It was like interesting enough, like it was always about aliens or something, but you liked it, because it
For
was
paradox, can you just for our audience, paradoxography, what is I had that as one of my questions. What
okay.
is paradoxography?
So when I say it's like Ripley's Believe It or Not, again, paradoxographers hate that, and I'm really sorry that I said it. But just as an illustration for anybody who's never heard the term before, they would be collections of usually kind of like vignettes or sayings even uh, from certain writers who would collect a series of like extraordinary things or wonders. We can even use Thelma for this that they've heard about happening in certain locations. So, for example, there's one named Phlegon that I talk about occasionally. And, he had a collection of sayings where he'd be like, "I heard that in such and such a town at in, like, the year 50, this local woman gave birth to a monkey." Like, and, they were scared of it, so they threw it in the Tiber, like, whatever, right? Like, or there was a two-headed baby, they threw it in the Tiber. Or, I heard that the emperor actually created a taxidermy of a centaur, and if you go to the emperor's storehouse, you can see the taxidermied centaur. So there were always, like, things that you or, like, he would have a list of long-lived persons. So, like, I heard there was a guy in Thessaloniki who lived to be, like, 157. And then I heard there was a guy on Thasos who lived to be, like, 219. Like, he would just kind of list these random facts, right? That you'd be like, "Whoa, like, a monkey?" Whatever. Um, and so these were things that you're never gonna be able to prove, right? That are kind of miraculous, remarkable, noteworthy for one reason or another, and people enjoyed it, right? Like, whether or not they thought it was true, but it was a form of entertainment and information. And those kinds of collections were quite popular. But that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, where you didn't have to be like a literary genius to say that someone gave birth to a monkey or that a bat child was found in a cave. It's just something that you kind of chronicle and like, circulate for whatever reason, fun, reputation, whatever. And so those kinds of things were becoming more popular too. So in general, book culture, I think as the empire goes on, some people, especially like merchant class, may have more means than they used to. And so they maybe can't read or write, but they want to kind of be engaged, like keep up with the Joneses, right? Like if the aristocracy is like sponsoring Virgil, like the emperor sponsoring Virgil, or like engaging in this high literate culture, like what's a version of that we can do, right? Or like can we it was a sign of like reputation in antiquity to sponsor a library, right? Like whether it was in a temple or then like what we might call public libraries start to develop. The people who could sponsor those are just like rich dudes, right? But like it was a sign of like privilege and like you've made it if you can sponsor a library. So that's the kind of thing I think those practices are really interesting. And looking at that as a different lens into what's going on in terms of book culture and society at that time gives us a little bit of a better lens. I mean, long-winded answer to your question, but like, which came first, the community or the gospel? Like, people would have been interested in them. And I think they're playing to that interest.
Yeah, so that's why it's hard to divorce them, and maybe there is the connection to some degree, but your whole point isn't is there? It's the same question of the historical Jesus quest. Was there? Maybe. Uh, why are you acting like you can know, and why build upon already unverifiable ground to construct your entire model when sure there may be something there, but you're kind of like jumping to assumption here and then leaping from there rather than let's just be cautious and just say we don't know and then work from there based on what we can know. And that's all you're trying to do. And I think you've been misunderstood by some who go, she thinks there's no communities. And it's like, no, she even says that Mark's using, most likely aware of Pauline writings. These are community texts. I mean, like, at least in some way, it seems they are targeting communities, even if they're epistolary fictions, and who knows where that goes. But, uh, if I may, like, to with Thelma, this idea of the wondrous, the miraculous, Mark is like, boom, 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 boom. I mean, they're on boats, and he's walking on water, and then he's throwing out demoniacs, hinting at, I think, Rome with Legion, and, like, I mean, even from the outset, this is the beginning of the evangelion, right? If that's not in some way subversive or in some way something with Augustus, I mean, there's like a 9 BCE
The
calendar.
inscription.
Yes. I mean, what thoughts? Do you think there's something going on?
Well, I think certainly like what you just described with Mark of like the boom, boom, boom is paradoxography, right? Like I'm not saying he's a paradoxographer or it is paradoxography, but that idea of like, give me the short and sweet. Like this happened, this happened, this happened. Because they're all miraculous events, but also like that is what you get in the kind of writers we've been talking about. Like the character comes in, boom, they leave. Everyone's like, what was that? Right. But it is almost always a subversive figure. That's why I talked about Camilla in the piece, because she's a woman and a warrior. That's subversive. Like Jesus is the Messiah, but he gets killed. That's subversive, right? He's the Messiah, but he's essentially a peasant. I mean, like some people argue about where his social class actually is, but he's not who you'd expect, right? He's supposed to be a warrior, and he gets crucified. So it has that same subversive element to it. Um, what was the rest of the question?
Yeah, I guess it was just tapping into the Augustan even.
The Gaksham part. Yeah, I mean, I think some of that is kind of a later, almost like I don't wanna use the word misunderstanding. That's not what I wanna drive at, but, like, even calling the Gospels gospel, like, we have to remember that word existed. Like, it was a word, like, Augustine referred to himself as, like, a savior, you know? There are inscriptions where he says, like, "Here's my gospel," like, "Here's the good news about my reign." So the idea that we have another, again, like, founding figure, or, like, holy man or, like, significant leader, and let's face it, I mean, Paul sees Jesus as a future political leader. There's no other way around it. He's a military figure as Messiah. So this idea that you would use that kind of language with someone who eventually, at least an apocalyptic sort of, imagination is going to go toe to toe with Rome. Like, doesn't that make sense? I mean, who are his political enemies from birth and some of the other gospels? They're the leaders, right? Because he's gonna be the future leader, and this goes back to what you were saying with, like, who inherits Rome? Is it the Romans who continue to just march on the way they are, or is it, like who are the inheritors of the kingdom? So I think all that fits, but it actually also fits with Euripides, who you're just mentioning, who in something like the Medea uses that term all the time in the text. She'll say like, tell me the gospel, like tell me the news, tell me what's going on. So you're basically getting a report about like a significant event, and to put it in those terms makes a lot of sense.
You mentioned something to the degree from Aristotle to Herodotus and Pausanias. The amazement of Thelma is considered the result of either relative rarity or lack of knowledge, sometimes both. Moreover, writers of Thelma go to great rhetorical pains to substantiate their marvels with autopsy. You mentioned autopsy. That is personal self-verification or claims about eyewitnesses who are at times encoded in the narrative itself. This is the struggle. Like, you're dealing with people who are trying to read this stuff like, "This happened, and we have eyewitnesses," and then you have, like, you come along and go, "Yeah, it's kind of a thing." It's kinda what you do when you're writing these tales, if I can, get the reader to kind of indulge and be kinda gaslit, like you were talking about the centaur. Hey, yeah, 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 it's in the emperor's bedroom chamber, you can go look at it
Yeah,
yourself.
who's gonna actually go there and look at it? Nobody, right?
Nope,
Yeah.
right.
Well, it's the ancient equivalent maybe of like, my boyfriend in Canada, like, or my girlfriend in Canada, right? Like, you can't really verify, although these days you can, I guess, a little bit better. But you can't, you can make these kinds of claims if you think that you have, it's not even gaslighting people as much as it's like complicit fiction, right? Like to some extent. Like if you want to be entertained by paradoxography, you're willing to keep a certain amount of scrutiny at the door to believe that someone gave birth to a monkey, right? Like, or to believe that there's somebody who lived to be 500 years old or whatever it is, right? And so you are there sort of like for the artfulness of it, the creativity of it, or the novelty of it, right? And that's sort of what I think the gospels are offering as well, because as I mentioned, people we know were interested in like Judean holy books. They were interested in that region, I think, in part too, because it was so contested. And then, especially after the Jewish War, I mean, it's minted on all the coins. Like, you get what we call the Colosseum because of the sacking of that temple in Jerusalem. I mean, it becomes a centerpiece of Roman Empire. And so wouldn't you be a little bit curious about these people, their practices, who they are, their history? I mean, why else do the Flavians have Josephus write a history of the Jews, right? Like there is just an interest. And so here is an example too of a subversive figure that's part of this anticipated messianic event, right? And I think I've talked to you about how sometimes I have my students, a question I'll ask them is to like write me what Paul would have said if he lived to see the temple fall. Because how would he have explained that? You've been telling people for decades now that Jesus is going to come back, marshaling his heavenly army, and come down and vanquish all the archons. The archons showed up and they destroyed your temple. And where was he? Right. And I don't mean that as like a challenge to the faith, but I mean that as like, how do you explain that? Like that tragedy. And that tragedy alone, too, would I think have been of a subversive interest, right? Like, who Jesus comes to represent far more in that respect than the holdings of a community oral tradition, if you see what I mean. And that's why I think people want to chronicle what's going on, whether it's in the form of a gospel or the circulation of Paul's letters for discussion or one of the non-canonical gospels, because it's an occasion for a lot of critique of empire, of literary, skill, right? Like, of seeing the artfulness of the writer themselves, of an interpretation of a scripture for which everybody has an interest in the place and the people and the destruction and the warfare and the results of that. And I think we lose sight of that a little bit. Like, what is going on in that late first century that I think inspires a lot of that interest and that engagement. So I think the Gospels are capturing some aspect.
You mentioned Aeneid, Virgil does, like, clearly what's his goal other than to show why Rome over against the earlier Greeks they're better. They're more morally, I mean, like, everything about it, even reversing the kind of perception of Troy to making them the well, good. And that also shows you the shift in philosophy post-Plato, like, how the impact of some of this stuff starts to shift the mindsets of people and how they're perceiving it. But I don't know if you've heard of the scholar Bruce Loudon. He's dead now. He's a classicist.
I don't think so.
He wrote an excellent article on Luke 24. It's in a book on Greek myths in the Bible that he wrote, where he goes into other stuff, but this one was really funny because it shows irony, it shows theoxany, it shows like a delayed recognition scene. Luke 24, Cleopas and some unknown disciple have no clue that it's Jesus, the Lord himself, right next to them on the road, right? The irony is there. Well, he wanted to go to scripture like everyone. He's trying to do the the first go and check it with Jewish sources first before we try to go anywhere else. And I get the temptation because there's so much "Thus saith the Lord" or "It is written," and there's a lot of scripture mentioned. By the way, Dennis McDonald thinks that the reason they have to say that is because their audience doesn't know. Whoever's reading this
Most
probably.
likely. You could
He thought this was interesting because he pointed out that Luke's using the Septuagint. And in the Septuagint, when you get this Abraham story with Sarah, and of course, Yahweh in disguise, you don't know it's him, she laughs when he's like, "Oh, she's gonna be pregnant." She's like 90 years old. And then the child's name means laughter. So there's a pun and the irony with this God in disguise. The pun doesn't work in the Septuagint. It only works in the Hebrew. So he goes, "I don't think that's where Luke gets this from." And then he goes to Odyssey 2. Telemachus is there with Nestor, and Nestor's like, "Listen," he's trying to encourage him, and he's like, "Listen, we need to pray, to Athena." Athena is right there in disguise next to them, dressed as the mentor, looking like the mentor, some male figure. And they're like, "Please pray that Athena will help us like she did your father, Odysseus, Telemachus." And Telemachus is doubting, and he is just down, and he's like, "No, it's not gonna happen. We're too far away. The gods aren't gonna." So the mentor, Athena, says the prayer that Nestor asks her to pray to Athena. Athena is supposed to pray to Athena, and so does. And then when Telemachus starts doubting, she jumps in and corrects him the same way Cleopas is doubting. "You of all people in Jerusalem don't know about our Lord. He was the Messiah." And like he then corrects Cleopas. Well, Telemachus corrects, or Athena corrects Telemachus and says, "Listen, Mr. Telemachus," because his name means fighter from afar. "Even the gods can rescue you or help you from afar, Mr. Fighter from afar." The pun is in the name, right? In the Greek. Well, Cleopas, he points out, has connection to the ancient Cleopatra or something to the Greek. I am not a philologist. I am not anyone who knows any of this. I'm just telling you what the article, at least I'm probably butchering it a little, but it's the name means like glory of the Father. So he's like, "Look, the Christ had to do this to enter into the glory, Mr. Glory of the Father." The pun is in the narrative, and Christians that I've bumped into online that aren't, like radicals are impressed. But like the ones that are fundamentalists look at this and go, "This all happened." And I read this and go, I love this. Like, I love the Bible more now that I know this hidden treasure is all throughout it. Thelma, like your stuff, like, what in the world? Anyway, I just thought I'd mention that.
Yeah, no, that's a great example, and, like that and it's also important to widen the lens and look at what's going on socially to help explain those things, right? Because if you object to something like that, then basically what you're saying is, "I object to this being situated in its actual, like, time period," right? Or its actual genesis, like, not to put too fine a point on it, I mean, like, we have to be conscious of why we look for origins, like, that's a whole other conversation, but if we do wanna try to understand the historical context and development of these texts and their importance, you have to look at that stuff, right? Like, what were these they didn't come out of nowhere, right? They are still human beings who were part of a social fabric, and to understand what that looked like is important. another part of that that kind of relates to what we were just talking about is what's going on too with like imagery about captives and other people that Rome has conquered. Because it's not exclusive to the texts, right? Or something like the Gospels that might be engaging some of the empire and so forth. It also has to do with ideas around like people in this period, especially the wealthy and elite, love to have images of like Roman conquests on their sarcophagi. And they're incredibly brutal and they're incredibly violent. And, later emperors will have, triumphal columns where you'll have like women's hair being ripped, like as they're pulled away from their screaming children and the men being beheaded and like, horrible, horrible scenes, people, getting their faces trampled in, people having something like the captive Gaul in their homes. So the text actually brings that forward too, right? And like we were talking about subversion, it's actually bringing forward kind of a meditation on the violence of empire as well. That some people are embracing as like a nationalistic form of expression and even something as like fundamental as how they're going to be memorialized in death or how they decorate their homes. But it also, like, I'm sure some people objected to that, right? Like to the violence or the brutality of what's going on because it's them today, it's you tomorrow, right? And so that gospels are tapping into some of that kind of potential conflict, like societal conflict, and how do you get to express it and where, right? So that's an interesting piece of it too, I think, for us to keep in mind.
Overall, it looks like Mark is playing all sorts of literary rhetorical games and having fun doing that. And I wanted to highlight your article. It's really part of the book. So is this actually like isolated in its own article somewhere as well, or do you
What,
recommend
the
people?
Thelma stuff or so the Thelma thing was a chapter that I was writing for my second book, but then I decided to use it for this, because I decided to go in a different direction with the second book, so that's kind of a another conversation. So it's a standalone piece, in the next quest for the historical Jesus. So and then also I have, another kind of expansion of the idea that's gonna come out with the journal Early Christianity, where I talk about Verda too in the Messianic Secret. So and paradoxography. So I'm using the same kind of observation about Thelma and trying to link it together in a few different forums. So it's now become sort of a standalone project. So I've got a bunch of like little standalone things I've always wanted to do or that were part of something else that I'm starting to kind of put feelers out.
Final question about the whole messianic secret, and then we'll wrap things up because there's so much more, honestly, we could get into. He's trying to say it's a theological thing. Of course, it gets interpreted that way, but later, of course. But the original intent, what is that original intent? Do you look to Virgil over specifically look to Odyssey, even though I know Virgil's using the Odyssey? For trying to understand why they have Jesus be so secretly kind of hiding who his identity is, though you, the reader, know the whole time. And is this a jab since maybe Mark knows Paul and so in his letters, not actually know the guy. Is this a jab at the 12 or is that we're going too far and we just need to stop playing that game and just go, listen, this is part of writing a fiction and here we have a guy, whose identity is clearly divine of some sort, whether it's imbued at baptism, which later what do you call them? The Basilidians and other groups wanted to say that it's like the divine indwells you and you become divine, so to speak, at baptism rather than birth, which Matthew and Luke kind of add, which later on, of course, here we are with this like trying to insert these ideas back onto these stories. Um, what do we do with this secret identity thing is what I'm saying.
Um, so I think that the Homer is a fine place to go, right? Like, I think that that's totally fine. It's more linear in the sense that you're dealing with Greek to Greek, comparison. As I mentioned before, if you go to Virgil, you're suggesting the gospel writers maybe know Latin. The reason I went to Virgil is I thought that the way that those scenes were constructed were so close to the kind of short and sweet vignettes that you get in the Gospel of Mark that looks so similar to me. And also, I don't this is where I am always cautious because I like to be very clear about what I can tell historically and what I can't. Do I know that the gospel writers could read Latin? I don't, except that, there's a reasonable chance as a Roman writer they have some facility with that kind of material, right? So that's a greater conversation about what we can sort of determine historically on the basis of other evidence for how these guys were trained. So for me, that was mostly why I looked to Virgil, and it's sort of like Virgil's so inspired by Homer doesn't really make a difference, right? We're just kind of talking about first century writers in that case, who are writing some kind of founding story. I didn't think about the 12 when I was writing this. I am somebody who thinks that the Gospel of Mark probably presupposes Paul. And so there's like that's actually kind of a fun theory, right? Like, because Paul didn't exactly get along with some of those guys. So calling them a bunch of idiots is kind of a convenient foil. But at the same time, kind of bringing this all around, Jesus is traveling with his disciples to the city, and that's who's around him. And so you can have these crowds float in and out and have this misrecognition, or have this Thelma reaction. But he has a built-in audience with the 12. So I can see how that works as well. And then they sort of become the avatar for the reader, right? Like, you don't know who this guy is either. And so you sort of journey with them through the story. And then you have the recognition along with as an audience member, along with the disciples. And that's back to saying, like, Mark's really a genius. Like, that's a nice touch. That's a really nice touch as part of the gospel. So I think there's some combination of that.
Yeah, it's a struggle because we see it in Joseph, the delayed recognition myth in the story of Joseph in the Old Testament, where he's toying with his knucklehead brothers who just don't get it, and there's 12, of course. And this is why I flirt with what Dennis is saying about eclectic mimesis, where it seems like this guy knows more than just one story, and he's able to craft and blend his own stuff. We know, like, Dionysius of Halicarnassus talks about this, Cicero, other figures who are like, taking and merging and making, like, your own artistic rendition. But, Bruce Loudon, the guy I mentioned earlier, said he thinks that delayed recognition potentially has influence from Homer in the Joseph narrative in Genesis. Now, that's a side note. The point is, at the end of this story, where Joseph reveals his identity and his brothers happily ever after recognize it, the end of this gospel, I mean, I know that this has really stirred up some drama amongst the faithful, but it ends with they tell no one, and a lot of these Christians will see the part where he's like, "Go tell them that he'll meet them in Galilee," meaning they're already jumping to Matthew because of that, and they automatically assume, well, he already knew about Galilean appearances and all this kind of, like, baggage that we see from the other gospels and tradition, but, like, for they were terrified, and they told no one. And then they have to tack on a very tacky ending that for the longer ending that clearly repeats the day of the week and does stuff it shouldn't do, like, anachronistically, of course. What do we do about that ending, and does that ending, in your view, imitate anything any other literature like that?
Well, I mean, one thought I have about the ending is that it performs the function that we were talking about before. Can you tell the community is there? That's the kind of ending where somebody said, like, like, this ending is no good. It's a great literary ending. It fits the motif of the whole thing, misrecognition. Nobody knows who he is. Like, everybody's afraid. Mystery, 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 right? Shrouded in mystery. Who's the naked guy, right? Like, all shrouded in mystery. That mystery to that extent makes, like, for great reading, creative, innovative, whatever. It makes for lousy theology in the end, right? Because it doesn't spill the beans on the cross references in the scripture, and this is when did he become God? Like, there's more questions than answers with Mark in a lot of ways. And so I think that ending demonstrates, like, somebody was like, we gotta fix this, right? We gotta bring this in line with where we're at now. And so I would say that my comment on this, without getting too specific and again, going out too far, is to say we always want to be attentive to the function of a text at the time in which we're evaluating it, not is often different than the context in which it was written or started, right? So the way something is compiled later, edited later, added to later, functions later, is used later, doesn't necessarily mean that's what was going on when it was first written. And I think you do have that with Mark. So by the time someone's like, listen, these other gospels have all these appearances. I've maybe heard about some of these appearances. Where are they? Like, you've got to add them in, right? Because you have to bring it in line with what else is popular at this time. Matthew, Luke, right? So you have to do that. Just to create that consistency. And that's about later interpretation and practice. But it's still something that I think, tells us a lot about the social formation of early Christianity.
May I ask one more? I'm so sorry. This is the last one, I swear.
Yeah.
Okay. What if Mark is just I know you probably agree with this, but, like, I'm saying this for the viewer. What if Mark is just writing a myth, like a mythography or like a complete cultic mythic kind of, like you said, an origin myth or some type of myth, story that isn't concerned with what really happened? Like you said, it's romanticizing the kind of idea. It's exotic because it's Eastern slash, Syrian figure in Galilee kind of thing. Um, and like everything. It was such a viral, important text. It was so foundational to anyone who had communities around this that they just latched onto it in just myth after myth of narratives and epistles and fabricated an entire tower of theological and like pedigree and all of that after onto this gospel.
Yeah. I mean, something I've been thinking a lot about, and this is probably too much of a can of worms, but I've been thinking a lot about the naming lately because we often talk about the Gospels as anonymous. And that comes from this idea that, well, when the church fathers were quoting them, they didn't say, like, and so now I'm going to quote Matthew. They're often quoting Matthew, to be honest, even though they don't name it. But they call it the gospel or that there are these gospels. They don't give the specific names to them. So that's why I think scholarship has often said, like, well, this is why they were anonymous. Although that word anonymous carries a lot of weight, right? Because I think that certainly the names came later in the sense that there's an attribution that comes along. There's an organization that comes along. There's a way that these things start to circulate. There's an ending that's added, right? Like there's clearly some manipulations of the text. We can tell when things have been added in later or the adulterous woman passage, right? Like we all can see in some of the early manuscripts, like P66, it's not there, right? Like it gets added in later. So I think we have to be flexible in our thinking and accepting again, like there's a process for these things. So what was Mark trying to do? Well, it looks like an ancient kind of paradoxographical mystery, but that was popular. Like that's something people wanted to read. And so that as a one of a number of kinds of sources that are out there, along with something like pieces of the letters of Paul. I think Mark had that too, right? Stuff is just out there, whether or not second century citation practices are indicating which one is which or whatever. Like that's kind of a separate question. But you can see it's not until the second century that there's some kind of organization to how these things are compiled and circulated. And so I would say that we have to treat that a little bit differently than we treat like the original intentions of these things as best we can reconstruct them. But I think because of the unique elements we've been talking about, like the wonder, the Thelma, in Mark, we can say that this has a very kind of first century patina of a founding, heroic, mysterious figure along the lines of Homer and Virgil at a time when that kind of conversation would make a lot of sense.
Ladies and gentlemen, go check out Robyn Faith Walsh's books. Go in the description. All the links are there. You're doing so much stuff. Is there anything you want to promote right now? I mean, is there something you check out?
I've had a few things come out recently. So I had the Next Quest for the Historical Jesus, which we've been talking about. Let me try to remember. I have an article that just came out in Harvard Theological Review about what Paul thinks the moon is. That one's kind of fun. I had a piece come out in the Journal for the Historical Jesus, speaking of historical Jesus, where I create an alter ego of myself in the year 4025 or 4026, where I'm an archaeologist who has discovered an anthropomorphic mouse god in a city called Orlando, and I'm excavating it. And I think that this one particular, site must have been the cult site of the mouse, and I go through the mysteries of, like, how the mouse has revealed himself in human history. I'm not, for legal reasons, saying exactly what that is, but, you can check the you can check that article out. I have at least previews, on academia.edu, of that kind of thing. I had a piece come out on Laodiceans, Laodiceans, people have different pronunciations, which was a supposed forgery of a Pauline letter, but I point out that we're asking the wrong questions of that letter when we call it a forgery. We want it to say something about Paul, but that was not its intention when it was written, and we have to pay attention to what the context is of the writers when they create these things. And I compare that to Andy Warhol, so that one was kind of that one was kind of fun. Um, and I feel like there were other articles that I can't remember right now, but, I have a few things also forthcoming. Keep an eye out on some, on early Christian art, on some representations of Jesus with the magic wand. That's coming out soon. And that article about Verda, is coming out as well. So keep an eye out.
I hope you'll go check out those links. She also has 2 courses with MVP courses you can go watch and check those out as well. There's just a lot of material that you're doing, Robin, and I'm looking forward to seeing where your career in all of this goes and the kind of impact your work will do in inspiring others to kind of continue looking for these interesting things that aren't like, they're not the forefront of what a lot of people typically do. It's so comfortable to get into the groove of oral tradition, and this community was behind this letter, and, "Oh, let's reconstruct Q," and things like that, and I know, people have that, and that's stuff they love, but it's cool to see new different things take off in my view.
Well, thank you very much, and, thanks for this forum to talk to people about it. I appreciate it.
Thank you, and never forget, we are MythVision.